Hi, my name is Simon. Thank you for coming back, and thank you for your interest in Jewish history. In this chapter, we will discuss the second half of the 11th century, which was the better half. We have a great deal of information and not a great deal of understanding, but let's try and put together more understanding than just information. We have to get into some details, though, because events are intertwined. If you're a subscriber, thank you. Please comment. It makes a big difference for me. The 11th century history of the Jews was greatly affected by changes of power play in Europe and the Middle East. In Europe, a new power entity was gaining grounds, the Normans. To understand who the Norman people were, one should try and visualize an ethnic cultural mix of the Franks, the Vikings, and the Gaelic nations. The Normans advanced through Europe slowly. They were like a spill of honey. They were religious Catholics. They had a good dialogue with the Pope. They fought in many of the existing armies as mercenaries. They partook in the reconquest of Spain. They conquered southern Italy and Sicily from the Arabs. They also fought with and against the Byzantine Empire. And yes, they conquered England. In Asia and the Middle East, a new power had emerged, the Seljuks. The Seljuks were Turco Iranian people. They swept through the Asian prairies of Iran, Afghanistan, and Mesopotamia. They were like a bushfire. They used fast horses and could shoot a bow and arrow while mounted. They drove the Byzantine Empire far westwards, all the way to the Bosphorus. They advanced, they controlled Iraq, Syria, they got as far as Jerusalem, and I've actually got a map of their territory which I will show. Important to note about the Seljuks that they were strict Sunni Muslims, but they were miles apart from the Abbasids of Baghdad. Their tolerance of non-Muslims was nil. Now, there were no secrets those days, not like today. While the Seljuks were advancing, the Jewish community and authority in Baghdad was under serious pressure. They knew what was coming. They were getting prepared for a known disaster that awaited the community. Their leader, Ezekiel, was resourceful in attempting to relocate the center of religious authority. He unfortunately got tangled up with some politics and was caught between them, and he was killed by the order of the Caliph of Baghdad. It was a different time for everybody. So in 1058, he was killed by order of the Baghdad Caliph. He was an older man and he had some adult sons, which we will soon hear about. Back in Grenada, we are introduced to Samuel Hanagid, which basically means the minister, who was a scholar and the head of the Cordova yeshiva. A yeshiva is a Jewish religious college. In 1009, civil war struck the Andalusian Caliphate. Cordoba, the Andalusian capital, was raided and had to relocate in its entirety. Samuel Hanagid ended up moving to Grenada, which is the south of Spain, and serving as an army general and a minister to the Berber king. During his service, he produced quite a bit of Hebrew poetry, which we still have. His poetical work and further writing by his colleagues are considered the beginning of the golden age of Jews in Spain. I just want to point out that not all the Berber nations were the same. During Samuel Hanagid's tenure in Grenada, a civil war between Berber nations was fought in Morocco. The massacre of the Jewish community of Fez took place in 1033. It resulted in the slaying of 6,000 men. Women were spared. Spared for what? Aha! I need to clarify. The Fez massacre was not necessarily a religious massacre. To me, and to some, it sounds more like a result of a war between nations. Men were killed and women were taken. It was a war played by the Sahara rules. but I could be wrong. I'm reminding us that in Baghdad during those years, the head of the Jewish diaspora, Ezekiel, was executed in 1058. That was the last of the Geonim rabbis in Babylon. Jewish religious authority was still maintained in Jerusalem and in Morocco and in Spain. There was an attempt to re-establish the failing center of Jewish religion authority in Granada. Ezekiel's two sons arrived at Granada several years later. Let's talk about Granada for a while. Granada in Spain was a Berber kingdom. The Berbers were the original inhabitants of North Africa. As the Arabs conquered North Africa, each of the Berber nations fended for themselves. Some formed an alliance with the Arabs, some with one another, and some did not. As for Samuel Hanagid, he died in 1056 of natural causes. After his passing, his son Joseph became minister in his place. Joseph, at the age of 21, was also head of the Jewish community and was involved in many local and foreign politics. This proved to be his disaster in the years to come. He received with great honor the two adult sons of Ezekiel who arrived from Baghdad. The Jewish community of Granada had gained clout and influence. This became a problem. In 1066, Joseph was trying to negotiate a deal with the neighboring Arab Muslim state of Almeria. Arabs and Berbers are not the same. The problem was that the Berbers of Granada were the enemies of the Arabs of Almeria. On December 30th, 1066, Joseph Hanagid was accused of high treason and was executed. A frightened and incited mob of Berber population turned against the Jewish community. Several thousands were killed. It was the first Grenada massacre. The sons of Ezekiel, the scholar from Baghdad, were able to get away. And back in Western Europe, the final breach with the Byzantine Orthodox religion took place. In 1054, the Great Schism was declared. Catholics and Orthodox Christians had become a separate religion. They each declared the other as heretics. The schism was many years in the works, but when it became official, it was nasty. A wave of Catholic zeal followed. Now, in the Ashkenaz Jewish community, we hear of a great deal of religious work taking place. Rabbi Gershon was head of the Ashkenaz religion authority. He introduced a new set of rules for personal conduct. Yes, polygamy was no longer an option. In the south of France, Rashi, a learned rabbi and sage, produced a comprehensive set of commentaries on the Talmud and on the Hebrew Bible. As is often the case, Ashkenazi Jews saw themselves as separate from the Jews under Muslim countries. They compiled a different prayer book, they made their own rules, they also started speaking Old German that eventually evolved into the Yiddish language. In Europe, in general, a wave of Catholic ardor was taking place. The Norman nobility had sometimes accepted the Jews as a useful asset in their estate. Not always, though. In Norman England, for example, Jews were considered property of the crown and were protected for a while. In other places, less so. Catholic establishments in general had less tolerance for the non-Catholics. A wave of animosity for non-Catholics had swept through. Jews, Muslim and Orthodox alike were under pressure to convert. And now for southern Italy and Sicily. During the 11th century, both of them were reconquered from the Arabs and settled by Norman mercenaries. The Norman knights slowly encroached on the Muslims and Orthodox communities of South Italy. And yet, once taking charge, the Normans lived alongside the non-Catholics, Orthodox, Jews, and Muslims were involved in much of the activity. There were little to no restrictions. Some social pressure was applied for some to convert, but it was social pressure. And yes, some did. In 1096, the crusade to free Jerusalem from the Muslims had set out. The first of those was called the People's Crusade. The people were led by Peter the Hermit. These so-called people were mostly mobs of less informed individuals. They brought their families as well. They were so-called religious recruits. Pope Urban II was actually encouraging the process of the crusade. But the Pope was not able to predict how successful his call would be. The People's Crusade weren't true armies. They were driven by the negative aspects of humanity, by the bad, by the ugly. They moved from town to town and tried to get people to join them. The Jewish communities were ordered to convert at the point of the sword. Many thousands of Jews were martyred those days. It was a very difficult period. Though at the time each Jewish community had hundreds of martyrs within their ranks, their communities were only partially devastated. Some Jewish communities survived. Some made their way to safer territories like Grenada, South Italy, North Africa. In the Spanish expulsion that took place 400 years later, we learn of many names of families like Ashkenazi and Sarfati. Those families originated in Western Europe and made their way to Grenada to seek safety and a better life. I need to remind us all, and especially those who might seek to judge the Crusader movement, that those were not animals. They were mobs and behaved as such. Times were different then. Mobs and armies often practiced similar rules, jungle rules. The People's Crusade was defeated as they approached the Seljuk territory. It was a terrible massacre. 2 years later, the First Crusade set off. That was already the official crusade. The First Crusade different from the People's Crusade. They were able to reach Jerusalem, fight the Seljuks, destroy everything in their path, and establish several Crusader kingdoms. Needless to say, the Crusaders were not discriminatory in their warfare. They devastated Orthodox and Muslim communities as well. They were able to face the Seljuks in several battles. This was quite a feat. The Seljuks were incredible warriors. After the establishment of the Crusader kingdoms in the Levant, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was formed. The next year, they set about clearing off communities that were still untouched. This is when we hear about the Battle of Haifa. Haifa is a port city in Israel today. At the time, it was a fortified Fatimid Arab town in the north coast of the Holy Land. It had become a home to many Jewish scholars who had to flee Jerusalem in fear of the Seljuks. After the fall of the Jewish community in Baghdad, several more scholars arrived in Haifa and tried to establish the Sanhedrin in Haifa. The Sanhedrin was the main Jewish court, the body of law and religious authority. So Haifa had been a Muslim Arab stronghold and a center for boat building. The Crusades avoided Haifa so as not to delay reaching Jerusalem, and because the Haifa Arabs were not Seljuks. In 1101, 2 years after the Kingdom of Jerusalem was established, the Battle of Haifa took place. William of Tyre, the bishop and the historian, writes that Jews and Arabs fought valiantly alongside each other for several weeks in an attempt to hold the Crusaders off. I think this is the only mention of Jews fighting against the Crusaders. I thought it was worth mentioning. I'm feeling this chapter should be over. We got through the Great Schism, the First Crusade, the Fez and the Grenada massacre, and the end of the Jewish center in Baghdad. We have some precious time now to prepare for the 12th century. Please like and subscribe. It really makes a difference for me. And feel free to comment as well.